Good morning. This is the 10 Point, your guided tour of the best coverage in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm your host for Thursday, August 6, 2026. It's Emma Tucker at the helm of the newsroom, and Morgan Smith and Brian E. Watson curating today's edition. Before we dive into the headlines, a quick note from the desk. It can be hard to see past the daily deluge of grim headlines, but there are plenty of constructive things going on in the world, and you've shown a great deal of interest in reading about them. A look at the comments to our recent piece on an initiative to combat loneliness proves that readers were quick to offer suggestions for making small talk with strangers, and one shared his experience with an old boy coffee group. Also worth your time before the news, a lively reader debate on Gen X's affinity for bars, and one couple's journey renovating a ramshackle hut on the Irish coast into their dream home. Now, onto the headlines, including President Trump and newly minted Fed Chairman Kevin Warsh's unusually casual line of communication. Let's start there. President Trump has been seeking Kevin Warsh's counsel on issues such as how the Iran war is affecting the economy. This departs from precedent in a notable way, the frequency and informality of the contact between a sitting president and his Federal Reserve chair. Warsh, confirmed earlier this summer, brings a background that straddles Wall Street and Washington. He served on the Fed's Board of Governors from 2006 to 2011, then returned to private equity. The Iran conflict has introduced fresh supply-side uncertainty, particularly around energy prices and shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, and the White House wants real-time perspective on how those shocks transmit into inflation expectations and consumer spending. What makes this dynamic unusual isn't just the phone calls, it's that they're happening without the traditional intermediaries, without the formal briefing memos, and without the careful distance that past administrations have maintained to preserve the Fed's political independence. Markets are watching closely. If the perception takes hold that monetary policy is being steered from the West Wing, even informally, it could complicate the Fed's ability to anchor long-term inflation expectations. For now, the S&P 500 futures are up 0.19% at 7764, DJIA futures up 0.32% at 54,669, while Nasdaq 100 futures are down 0.37% at 29,504. James McIntosh writes this morning that Scott Bessent's yen trade has had unintended consequences for markets, and David Weiner argues the logic of a pharma mega-merger is questionable, but AstraZeneca's record isn't. We'll come back to markets in a moment. Next, airlines are pushing back against federal authorities' efforts to ramp up immigration enforcement at U.S. airports. The friction centers on ICE's increasing use of airport terminals, both secure and non-secure areas, for enforcement actions, including verifying immigration status during routine travel and coordinating with CBP to detain individuals flagged in databases. Carriers argue this disrupts operations, creates liability exposure, and undermines the passenger experience they're legally obligated to provide. Several major airlines have formally objected to what they describe as mission creep, ICE agents boarding aircraft at gates, questioning passengers during deplaning, and using airline manifests without warrants. The airline's position is that immigration enforcement is a federal law enforcement function that should occur at designated ports of entry or through judicial processes, not in the middle of a concourse where families are trying to make connections. The administration counters that airports are critical choke points for identifying visa overstays and individuals subject to removal orders. This fight is heading toward a regulatory showdown. The Department of Transportation may need to issue guidance on the boundaries of law enforcement activity in sterile areas, and Congress may be drawn in if carriers pursue legislative relief. For travelers, the practical effect is already visible: longer lines, more secondary screenings, and a palpable tension in terminals that used to feel routine. On Capitol Hill, a Senate panel investigating Dr. Anthony Fauci has obtained a copy of his iPhone, potentially securing even more records related to his actions during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a significant escalation. The device, presumably a government-issued phone used during his tenure as NIAID Director and Chief Medical Advisor, could contain messages, emails, and app data not captured in previous document productions. Senator Rand Paul is expected to hold a committee vote today holding Fauci in contempt of Congress, a move that would formalize the standoff between the panel and the former official. The contempt push stems from what the committee describes as incomplete compliance with subpoenas for communications related to the origins of the virus, gain-of-function research funding, and pandemic-era decision-making. Fauci's legal team has argued that many requested records are protected by executive privilege or contain sensitive personal information. The iPhone copy changes the calculus. If the device was backed up to a government cloud or managed by NIH, the committee may already have access to a trove of data that Fauci himself cannot control. This story sits at the intersection of oversight, science policy, and the lingering political fault lines of the pandemic response. We'll be watching that contempt vote closely. In financial regulation news, federal prosecutors earlier this year reviewed claims that J.P. Morgan Chase mishandled fraud cases. The review, conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, focused on whether the bank's internal controls and reporting mechanisms adequately detected and escalated suspicious activity, particularly in its consumer and small business lending divisions. The claims originated from whistleblower allegations that certain fraud patterns were systematically downgraded or closed without referral to law enforcement, potentially violating the Bank Secrecy Act and internal compliance commitments. J.P. Morgan has said it cooperates fully with regulators and continuously enhances its anti-fraud programs. The prosecutor's review did not result in charges, but it underscores the heightened scrutiny on large banks' fraud detection infrastructure, especially as synthetic identity fraud and authorized push payment scams grow more sophisticated. For the industry, it's a reminder that compliance isn't a checkbox, it's an ongoing arms race. Over in global sports governance, FIFA President Gianni Infantino will remain in the role and intends to run for re-election next March after securing the backing of senior executives during an emergency meeting. The meeting was called amid mounting criticism over the expanded Club World Cup format, the awarding of the 2034 World Cup to Saudi Arabia without a competitive bid, and concerns about governance transparency. Infantino's allies on the FIFA Council rallied behind him, emphasizing revenue growth. FIFA's reserves have topped $4 billion, and the expansion of youth and women's tournaments. Critics argue that the consolidation of power around Infantino has weakened checks and balances, and that the emergency meeting was stage-managed to preempt dissent. The re-election bid sets up a year of intense lobbying across the 211 member associations. For now, Infantino's position looks secure, but the fractures in global football governance are deepening. A story of profound consequence, Lobga Rangzan's self-immolation in New York City has galvanized the global Tibetan independence movement. Rangzan, a Tibetan activist in his 30s, set himself on fire in late July outside the Chinese consulate in Manhattan. He died days later. Self-immolation as protest has a long, tragic history within the Tibetan movement. Over 160 Tibetans have self-immolated since 2009, most inside China. Rangzan's act, on foreign soil, in full view of international media, has reignited debate about the movement's strategy, the role of the diaspora, and the Chinese government's policies in Tibet, including mass surveillance, forced assimilation programs, and restrictions on religious practice. Vigils have been held in Dharamshala, London, Paris, and across North America. The Chinese Foreign Ministry called the incident a tragedy but blamed separatist forces for incitement. For the Tibetan government in exile and advocacy groups, Rangzan's death is a stark reminder that the situation inside Tibet remains desperate, and that the world's attention has largely moved on. His name is now being invoked in congressional hearings, UN human rights submissions, and a renewed push for targeted sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for Tibetan affairs. Now, a story that has shaken the world of private market investing. When Elon Musk's SpaceX went public this summer, some investors who bought into special purpose funds touting pre-IPO holdings thought they had scored big. Instead, they are facing a nightmare. Investors in a firm called Late Stage Management say their expected returns vanished after the firm claimed it sold their underlying shares years ago, despite online portals and tax documents suggesting otherwise. Corey Drybush reports that as the SpaceX IPO lockup period starts to expire, hundreds of similar pre-IPO funds face a crucial test on whether they can actually deliver. The structure here is opaque. Retail and accredited investors buy into feeder funds that claim to hold shares of private companies like SpaceX, Stripe, or Databricks. But the chain of custody is often murky. Shares may be held through multiple SPVs, subject to transfer restrictions, or encumbered by side letters. In Late Stage Management's case, investors say they were shown portal balances reflecting SpaceX holdings, received K-1s indicating partnership income, and were told their shares were locked up until post-IPO. Then the firm said the shares had been sold in 2023, before the IPO even happened. The discrepancy has sparked lawsuits, regulatory inquiries, and a crisis of confidence in the pre-IPO secondary market. For anyone holding similar funds, the lesson is brutal: verify the underlying custody, demand audit confirmations, and understand that a portal balance is not a stock certificate. From high finance to a deeply personal reckoning, former Cincinnati councilman P.G. Sittenfeld didn't realize how addicted he was to his phone until he went to prison. Before surrendering to the Federal Correctional Institution in Ashland, Kentucky, Sittenfeld made one final call to his wife from a McDonald's parking lot, the last time he would hold his iPhone for more than 4 months. In an essay for the journal, Sittenfeld reflects on the irony of his involuntary separation from a device that had practically become an appendage. He describes the first weeks, the phantom vibrations, the reflexive reach for a pocket that held only a prison-issued ID, the disorientation of having no feed, no notifications, no way to curate his own relevance. But as Sittenfeld writes, this isn't a tale of transformation. He didn't emerge enlightened, cured of the itch. He describes the contraband phone economy inside, the risks inmates take for a few minutes of Instagram, the way the device remains the ultimate currency. His insight is sharper and more unsettling. The addiction isn't to the screen. It's to the possibility the screen represents, the chance that something urgent, validating, or new has arrived. Prison removed the possibility, but not the craving. Since release, he carries a flip phone. He still feels the pull. It's a rare, unvarnished look at the architecture of attention from someone who had his freedom and his dopamine loop stripped away simultaneously. A lighter but surprisingly heated topic: what do you think is acceptable to wear at the office? As workplaces become more casual, opinions on what's appropriate work attire seem to be getting stronger. Everyone has sartorial do's and don'ts: sneakers with suits, shorts in July, the great hoodie debate of 2023. The Journal has a quiz today so you can see how your personal dress code stacks up with other Wall Street Journal readers. It's a reminder that even as norms relax, the signaling function of clothing hasn't disappeared, it's just gotten more coded. Happening today, Senator Rand Paul is expected to hold that committee vote holding Fauci in contempt of Congress. Earnings on deck: Lyft, Airbnb, Fox, and Constellation Energy. And of course, today's paper. The number of the day: more than 300 million. That's the number of people who ask health-related questions on ChatGPT each week, according to OpenAI. Research shows most American adults now view their test results online before speaking with a physician. Now, a growing share are uploading those lab reports straight into AI chatbots, leaving doctors to contend with a powerful new version of Dr. Google. The implications are profound. Patients arrive with AI-generated differential diagnoses, drug interaction analyses, and treatment suggestions, sometimes accurate, sometimes hallucinated, always confident. Physicians report spending more visit time correcting misinformation than explaining care plans. Health systems are scrambling to develop AI literacy materials for patients and guardrails for clinicians. The genie is out of the bottle. The question is whether the medical establishment can shape how it's used. And finally, a mysterious avenger is escalating a war against Scotland's parking police. A Scottish seaside town is locked in battle with a vandal targeting local parking police. Equipped with superglue and expanding foam, the mystery vigilante has defaced dozens of newly installed parking meters across North Berwick. Police say they are working to crack the case, but in a town fed up with parking enforcers, nobody is talking. The meters, part of a controversial pay-and-display expansion, have become flashpoints for resentment over tourism pressures, second home ownership, and the feeling that local authorities prioritize revenue over residents. The vandal, dubbed the phone phantom by locals, has become a folk hero in some circles. Each morning brings a new meter gummed up, a new ticket machine foamed shut. The council has spent thousands on repairs and private security. The police have CCTV footage but no leads, and a community that, when asked, simply shrugs. It's a small story, but it captures something universal: the friction between administrative order and the lived experience of place. Beyond the newsroom, after Abdul El-Sayed's victory in the Democratic Senate primary, Michigan voters will have to decide how polarizing and left-wing they want American politics to become. And from Wall Street Journal by side, the new release from PopSockets is slim and multifunctional, providing extra grip and a stand. That's your briefing for Thursday, August 6th. The 10-point is curated by Morgan Smith and Brian E. Watson, under Editor-in-Chief Emma Tucker. I'll be back tomorrow with the next edition. Have a good day.